Now that we have taken a close look at the vast need to accelerate acquisition, bridge gaps in defense supply chain, sustain readiness more effectively, and modernize faster, one key question remains. Can we produce enough to support our goals? How can we enable that factory that supports the fight? The U.S. Navy stands at a critical inflection point with its industrial base. Our public shipyards are recapitalizing to address growth in aircraft carrier and submarine maintenance as the fleet ages while facing increased operational tempo. Our private shipyards have well-documented challenges dealing with a surge in demand for both surface and submarine production. The AUKUS agreement has added even more urgency to scale submarine and maritime production. Meanwhile, emerging technologies like advanced robotics, AI-enabled inspections, and proactive data analytics offer promising solutions for transforming naval production and sustainment by having a digital thread that runs through the entire process. So today's discussion explores how we can leverage these innovations to reignite America's maritime industrial base and ensure our fleet remains ready for a great power competition. I'm thrilled to introduce our next session, Production and American Re-Industrialization, featuring Christopher Miller, Executive Director of Naval Sea Systems Command, Brent Sadler, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation and retired Navy captain, Troy Demmer, founder of Gecko Robotics, and our moderator, Defense One reporter Laura Williams. Please help me welcome them to the stage.
All right, we made it. Thank you for that introduction. I am Lauren Williams, Senior Editor at Defense One, and in this panel, we get to talk about all of my favorite things, robots, AI, and shipbuilding. Chris, I'm going to start with you. Tell me everything that keeps you up at night and anything that's going on that's new at NAVSEA.
There's a lot that keeps me up at night right now, but I'll talk about what I'm passionate about, which is really how do we get back to where we need to be in the industrial base. So first off, let me throw some numbers out there. 674. Anybody know what that number is? The days until 1 January 2027. That is where we've been told that we need to be ready as a nation and as a Navy for sustained combat operations against a real peer adversary. That is not the one and done number. That's when we need to really be ready. And so I throw that out there as we don't have a lot of time. Right? And when you think about shipbuilding, we usually talk in years, right? We don't think about shipbuilding in days and months. And so I would encourage you all, we can much have a really deep conversation around that, but that's the first thing that really keeps me up at night is, are we doing everything we can to be ready by 1 January 2027? And then that kind of goes into two ways. One is force generation. What can we do to accelerate the construction of our new ships? And I'll probably get into this, but we have a record number of ships under contract today, which is a good news story. The challenge we have is we have to now get that industrial base, which is atrophied over like the last 40 years, back to where it needs to be. And this is not unique to the Navy. This is really a national issue when you think about the manufacturing workforce. So the second part of that is we've got to get better at how we adopt technology and advanced manufacturing. I do not believe we have a technology problem. We have an adoption problem. We have to figure out how to get some of these cutting edge things, whether it's robotics, AI, laser ablation, additive manufacturing, into our production environments, both in the private side and the public side, so that we can get back where we need to be. Then on the readiness side, it's about getting our avails done on time. And we've gotten better. For those of you who aren't tracking, we've increased by 40%. In this past year, we are actually in the mid-60s in terms of on-time readiness, material maintenance things that we do on our Navy. So we're moving the right direction, but we've got a lot of work still to do. And we're learning from industry, and we want to continue to apply those. But we've got to really get better on the planning side, making sure we really understand the work, and then making sure that we have all the materials and everything we need to execute that on time. And then the last thing I would just say from the Navy perspective, it really is the foundation. And I will take the foundation a couple different ways. Clearly, our workforce is the core. How many of you had a job in the 80s? You don't have to raise your hand. Don't be shy. How many of you had a job in the 80s? You know, think about what you made in the 80s. If you were working in the industrial environment in the 80s, you made 4 to 5 times minimum wage. So think, you know, $15 to $18 an hour. Today, if you start in the shipyards, whether it's public, private, we can debate, you're making $22, $23 an hour. That is barely keeping up with the starting salary at reasonable jobs in the environment. And we're asking those people to work in a highly industrial environment. So think about that, right? We are trying to get people into these jobs. We are trying to get people excited to go work in hard industrial environments. And we've got to get that equation right. It's just not pay. It's also things like childcare. It's about housing. It's things like that that we also have to get right for the entire package. But the foundation is also about making sure we have good data to really make better decisions. It's about making sure that our shipyards get modernized, as I kind of talked about. And it's also about making sure that we have the infrastructure around the shipyards, whether it's suppliers, whether it's key technology, there when we need it so that we can actually do the work correctly. You know, my message to everybody is you got to think about us in the industrial base as one big marriage. Admiral Greenert used to say, whether we like it or not, the industrial base and the Navy, we're married and there's no chance of a divorce. We have to come together. This is a we discussion, right? I can't solve this alone with money. I can't solve it alone just with a single technology. We've got to come together and really question everything we do. We have to think, act, and operate differently. And we have to be willing to learn and change how we do things if we actually want to improve the outcomes that are happening with our industrial base. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure we'll have much more detailed conversations.
We're going to dig into some of that in a bit, but Troy, I want to kick it to you to get your perspective on how robotics could maybe solve some of these challenges.
Absolutely. So Gecko Robotics started 10 years ago out of a dorm room. And the premise was we don't actually have enough data about the material health of the built world. And one way to help solve that problem was to take structured data that could only be gained through high-fidelity sensors, localized to the specific point of the asset, put on a robot or a modality to help get access to, you know, complex geometries, dangerous environments. One of the solutions for helping with these critical challenges to QA/QC in a production manufacturing line or maintenance and in the backlog thereof inside of, you know, a sustainment cycle is better data that can help inform how to take action and close the gaps that exist today. You know, we have about 230th of the shipbuilding capacity that China does. We will not outcompete them from a manpower standpoint. We have to out-innovate them, and it goes beyond robotics. You know, we have to leverage AI, and we have to be able to just move more quickly and nimbly, you know, through both the new build as well as the sustainment side. And I think there's a unique opportunity to tie those worlds together, where historically there's been the builders and the design engineers, and then there's been the maintainers, and that's usually a pretty far chasm that exists between those two groups. How do you create convergence that they're all operating off of a common data set?
Yeah. And Brent, from your seat, what are some of the biggest challenges that the Navy is facing now in terms of kind of re-energizing that industrial base? I know we talked before about the manpower issue, so I'm curious to hear more.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is that maybe set the scale of the problem, and also you're dealing with a culture, an institutional culture that since the Soviet Union collapsed, we've been in an institutional culture of shrinking or cost efficiencies. And now we have got to shift away from that mindset into one based on effectiveness, mission success, and expanding capacities. This means bending the curve from a down or flat to upward. And people are not used to thinking that way, both in the budget side in Congress, which that's, I think, clearly is changing, and I'll give some ideas and insights on that, but also inside the Pentagon, inside the shipyards. That's also not the environment that the people that are doing the hard work and making the budget decisions are used to thinking. And so there's a need to break from that. So there's a cultural problem. or change. I wouldn't say it's been a problem, it needs to change. And it seems like we are starting to bend that curve. The other is, when you look at just the scale of the problem, the last time Maritime Administration did a report on the number of ships that were doing, commerce for the United States, it was 80,000 port visits. We have less than 90 U.S. flagged and crewed ships capable of doing international trade. So our economy, the industrial base on which those Navy yards, commercial and public, rely on, is reliant on less than friendly shipping. And that industry, by the way, is the same or shares a lot of the same skills, technical expertise, and the people. So when you have a weak or a too much atrophied naval shipbuilding enterprise, you could normally be able to go over to the commercial sector and say, hey, let's try and pull some of that latent capacity. Well, we've gutted that too. So we have a significant problem where we have to build up our commercial shipping, and this is what Congress is looking at with the Ships for America Act. There's hopefully going to be a relook in the new Congress to revise what we got a little bit of a sneak peek on in late December of last year. But we also have to do more investment in the Navy shipbuilding to get those programs that are delayed, the manpower shortages, the antiquated shipyards modernized, and also perhaps even add more entrants, more players on the field. And again, the 2027 year, there is an urgency to act. We're beyond the window of where we're going to build the fleet that we need. We're not going to be able to defeat a China with the fleet that we have necessarily. It's the one we're going to have to fight with now, if that's what if the Chinese decide that this is the time frame they're going to go on. So how can we, with that timeline in mind, the next best thing that we can do is make sure we've set the foundations for a rapid mobilization of our maritime industry, getting a supply base, and things like the data analytics of where production is occurring, where parts and certain materials are needed, but also the workforce. Those are the types of things that we need to be doing now so that if a war occurs, say January 2nd, 2027, we already know who and where to go to double, triple our shipbuilding activity very quickly.
And I guess this is to everyone. To that point, do you think that there is enough visibility into that supply chain? I know we heard earlier that a lot of the delays can start at like the lower tiers in terms of like the supply chain. Is there enough visibility there to actually make sure that the capacity can be met to meet demand?
I would say we are much better today, but it's not perfect. We are still learning. I would say our challenge right now is a couple of things. One is, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here in a decrease, but in the nuclear world, we went from over 17,000 suppliers down to 5,000. So we do not have the same depth that we used to have in the nuclear supply chain. The challenge we're having right now is getting those suppliers to be up and producing at the rate we need them. And so that's where things like additive manufacturing and new technologies come in place. But we are much more educated today in terms of what the key materials are. We know what we need to have in advance, but it's taking a while for the supply chain to generate the materials and the parts when we need them.
To what degree is additive manufacturing being used?
In what way? I mean, I'll be flipping a little bit. I can go anywhere in the Navy and you will see additive manufacturing, but it's not solving our biggest problems. What I will tell you though is within the last year, and this is a lot of effort from the Maritime Industrial Base Program Office and some folks in our technical authority, we have really pressed the accelerator and going after the really hard problems, not the simple polymer things, but really hard material combinations that really do provide parts into our availabilities. And so I would give you one of our recent boats, we're up over 100 critical parts are now coming via additive manufacturing, and we just see it accelerating. And so it's taken time, and I think what I would offer is some of these things are just cross-functional because we had to get the technical community comfortable with these things. I had to get some people good enough to build them. I had to convince my technical community that they were just as good, if not better. I had to get the supply chain ready. But we are starting to see a return on additive manufacturing, where I call the really good kind of problems. We're beyond just talking about it. We're actually into doing it. But just to give you an idea, we've spent in the last couple of years over $200 million just in additive manufacturing areas to try to accelerate this area because we see what the game changer it can be, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Will we ever see, I'll be cheeky, will we ever see like a completely 100% additive, 3D printed submarine? Or like to what degree can we expect to see 3D printing additive manufacturing used in shipbuilding?
Well, I'm not sure it'll ever be 100%, but clearly we can do better than we're doing today.
Yeah.
Right, we can build bigger components. The challenge there, and if you've ever get a chance to go to Danville and see what they're doing down there, the challenge is some of these things get to be very, very large. And so you still have to be able to, bring these together, integrate them, stack them on top of one another. But we have been having some really good conversation about how far can we really press those materials to build bigger and bigger. Because we all recognize there's great opportunity there, but I don't know if I ever get to 100%, but I want to keep getting bigger and bigger every chance we get.
Okay. I want to talk a bit about like big M manufacturing. Steven Feinberg, who is President Donald Trump's pick to be the Deputy Secretary of Defense, his confirmation hearing was yesterday, and one of the things that he mentioned was giving big manufacturers like car makers and more of a chance to compete for defense contracts to kind of increase production capacity, particularly when you're talking about shipbuilding. I know there's some precedent there, but Brent, I'll start with you. Like, is that a viable solution? How fast could that be up and running?
So that's part of the solution. The other part that, and I'm still going through the hearing, so I did hear DPA trying to get more of those authorities, like what we learned in COVID. Again, the auto industry got involved in building ventilators. So they are an adjacent industry. Offshore oil is another one where there's a lot of commonalities. The other issue is that when we're trying to grow, we're going to also have to spend more because a company, if you're an offshore oil company, and now you may have competitors or you may have added jobs or added requirements added or contracts onto you, you're going to have to expand your job base. And everyone's having a problem with labor. So how that actually gets resolved, it's going to take some time. I think with the money and with the orders, the demand being steady, and I think we're going to see that. I think we're going to get past the labor side. But we need more players on the field now, and one of those is, of course, going to the big manufacturing. But I think that's not the full answer. The other part of this is getting new companies. Maybe there's a SpaceX kind of thinker or innovator out there in venture capital that would want to get into shipbuilding, has no experience, not involved in that sector at all, but comes in with a fresh perspective. We're going to need some of that. Unmanned vessels is one of those areas, and there's a lot of players, but they're not scaled yet for Navy use for like a Pacific fight. The other is attracting capital investments. And so this is getting money into new shipyards, getting money into existing shipyards to modernize, to grow workforce, to expand the productive capacity at these places. That takes capital investment. And things like Hanwha's investment in Philadelphia Shipyard is an example of trying to attract capital investment from treaty allies specifically, but also other American investors too. And the way that you have to do this, you have to create a favorable investing environment into the maritime sector. And the only way you're going to do that is not through DoD or through Navy shipbuilding. You have to include that with the commercial side. And so this is getting that balance right. I'm watching what's happening at Philadelphia Shipyard very closely. It's not the only case, but keep the orders and contracts coming, keep the money assured and predictive and assured, and then also set an environment that's conducive to capital investment.
Yeah. Troy, I know you're not a shipbuilder, but I'm curious from an industry perspective if you feel like the demand signal is there. Like, can you talk a bit about how Gecko Robotics, how you guys navigate making sure that you can meet the demand that the government puts forth?
Yeah, a couple comments on that, and completely agree with what Brett and Chris are saying here. That one area to look is in the venture capital community, and bridging the sort of commercial to DoD entire supply chain, because we have deployed over the last 10 years $250 million of investment, and what we've seen is the challenges, whether they bring on a commercial nuclear reactor or sustaining a critical energy generation resource, is those problems exist in the DoD as well, and they're probably accentuated. and yet we can move quickly because we've deployed these, the capital, and we've built these technologies over the last decade. And I think specifically one thing that is important is like we give ourselves a chance to catch up on the capacity side of building new by extending the life of the assets we have. We really do have to make sure that the old is there to cross this chasm, whether that be renewable energy sources as a critical input to all the manufacturing base, how we're getting rare earth minerals to the process manufacturing side, the inputs, the critical inputs to a shipbuilder. And we are deployed today on production contracts. I mean, we are working inside of the nuclear reactor supply chain, and there's some very interesting things when you sort of go all the way back to the sort of initial starting point, which is steel. Like, how good is that steel? And as you move through the supply chain, diagnosing that and understanding that as early as possible. Otherwise, you're just chasing your tail on non-conformances and problems along the way.
Yeah. And Lauren, I just offer a couple of thoughts real quick. So one is I give you two case studies I think are illustrative. One is, if you remember the Replicator initiative, we had to do small unmanned surface. Well, that was actually built up at NAVSEA in Baltimore. That was a venture capital model. They came in, they actually rapidly built the infrastructure to go do this. Now, granted, those are not big, complex ships, but it shows that the model can work if we get the right kind of alignment between the money, the companies, and the venture capital. So that's one example where we're able to kind of lean in. The other example is down in the Gulf Coast with Conrad Shipbuilders. Never really done work with the Navy, NAVSEA. We actually have been working to bring them up into as one of our developers, or sorry, one of our shipbuilders, and they are just now getting ready to deliver their second berthing barge for us, and they're actually ahead of schedule. Not very often that we get up here and talk about delivering ships ahead of schedule. And so I do think there is capability out there. What we need to think about is, how do I uplift them? How do I get them smart? How do I educate them on what it takes to actually build a Navy ship? Because some of our stuff is different. Some of our stuff we adopt commercial standards, but I do think we need to lean in there. And I'm all in for the SHIPS Act in terms of getting more commercial shipbuilding, because the number one challenge we have is workload, and if we had some commercial work, it would help balance out things tremendously, especially on the repair side. But even in the construction side, some commercial work, even if it's only a few percentage, we're not even at 1% right now. The best the US has been is about 5%. We're less than 1% in building commercial ships. So a little bit there will go a tremendous way in helping the entire industry get better in terms of our ability to produce ships.
I feel like this conversation keeps coming back to workforce. And so I'm going to pick it back up with you, Chris. The Navy has this Build Submarines campaign. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but they're at NASCAR races. They were, I think, at the Final Four, and was it last year? They're everywhere. How is that campaign going? Because it's quite a few billions of dollars kind of going into that.
So I think it's working in terms of getting people interested in coming into the shipbuilding industry. And it's just not Navy. This is for the entire, I really don't care where they go. If they go work at a public shipyard, they go work at one of our private, I really don't care. I just want them in the workforce. What I'm really monitoring right now is our ability to retain. I think it's an amazing ad campaign. All of you ought to go look at it. It's a great thing. What I'm nervous about is we have to show commitment to that workforce, keep them actually excited about the work, get them in the game, and get them to stay in the game. We have seen some challenges in some of the industry where we're just not able, and there's a lot of turnover, higher than what you would normally see in attrition. And so that's what I think is our next big challenge. I think that we're getting there in terms of recruiting. We're partnering with the regional, like community colleges and tech schools. The next big thing is we got to talk about all the other stuff that keeps people into the job. If you've ever been down to HII in Pascagoula, they have a Chick-fil-A actually in the shipyard. It's amazing. We need more things like that, whether it's childcare, whether it's housing, to make sure that we can actually get those people to stay. Because my worry is that this generation coming into the workforce has a desire to serve. It's amazing, but they also have a very short tolerance until they really want to start seeing where they're making a difference. And so we've got to do more. And this is really where our investment, just to give you an idea, we've put over $500 million in workforce development, but we got to work closely with the states and the regions to make sure we're addressing these things. A lot of these issues are regional. There's just not one silver bullet in some of these. When you go to any of these places, they all have a little different regional challenge, but we got to attack it everywhere we can so those people actually stay on the job.
Yeah, Brent.
Yeah, if I could add, so a couple of the observations touring a lot of the commercial shipyards as well as the naval shipyards is that there is a very high turnover rate. You might have someone working for just 6 months to 2 years. I think the average is down like around 4 years. The turnover rate is very fast for a highly technical kind of field and industrial environment, and that's across the board. So you have this high turnover rate. The only way you're going to get through that is you have to push through it and just keep those demand for contracts, for work, and eventually that 10% that decide to stay for 20 years will compound and you'll actually have a much more robust, much more capable. But what's happening is there's mistakes made at a higher order, a lot of rework that's occurring as this young workforce is relearning. Again, we're bending the curve and we're going upwards. And in that, there's going to have to be a kind of a youthful kind of workforce. It means they're going to make youthful kind of mistakes in learning. And that's also where we are right now in some of these shipyards. The other is geographic. I saw this up in the lakes, going to Marinette. You got folks that really want to work at the shipyard because the pay compared to their very rural town is very good, but they have to travel 4 or 5 hours to get to the yard. So, and I've seen that repeated, same story repeated in many different yards. So there's a geographic issue here too. Are we building ships where people want to build ships? Not the customer or the industry, but the workforce. So moving where the demographics are moving to the southeast makes sense to an extent, but also from strategic perspectives, the lakes, Great Lakes, but also looking over to the West Coast. Because if we do get into a war with China, we're going to need to have places in the West Coast to do the repairs. And so if you have yards big enough to build a Virginia-class submarine, build a Ford-class aircraft carrier, in that region of the country, you can also repair them if they get hit, and they have to be repaired quickly to get back into the fight with China. So there's a geographic piece to this that also is informed by a labor demographic.
I will say what I'm optimistic about is when you go to the shipyards and you see who's really embracing the new technology and you see who's excited about whether it's robotic welding or it's additive manufacturing, it's this new generation. They have a desire to do things very much in a digital native way, right? And so I see a lot of up potential there because they come in already savvy in some of these things we're talking about. And so I see a lot of potential. And they are very patriotic. They want to make a difference. And so I think if we can find the right marriage of us putting technology into these places and this workforce, it'll be a win-win. But I'll tell you, I go to a lot of shipyards. It's like taking a walk back in time. You need to go see these places, right? You've got materials that were there back after World War II and machines there from World War II. We have the occasional really cool thing, but for the most part, it is like going back in time. We all have to help pull these industrial operations into the 21st century and beyond, right? But I think the workforce is going to be there. They are excited by this stuff. They want to do this stuff, but we just got to all help kind of make a difference.
Troy.
To add some additional detail to that, and is, to attract and retain talent, you want to be using the modern tools. Would you rather be crawling around on your hands and knees inside of a void, or hanging off the side of a freeboard ship, or would you rather be deploying a drone or a robot to collect data at high fidelities, and then be an analyst on top of that to really understand and contextualize what you're looking at? I think that these, we've seen a reversal of, number of people that wanted to be quote unquote inspectors or welders as you start to give them these advanced tools. It's just more interesting to operate. And then on the, the new late talent that are maybe inexperienced, you also have some safeguards in place, right? You have some redundancy in technology like robots that are encoded and know where they've been and have sort of a mapping of the geospatial domain. You can review that data multiple times over. Things can be audited. Today, if someone's interpreting it on their Palm Pilot, that's gone. You don't have that original data form. And so creating the data foundation allows for scalability around how do you do this in a, maybe pool your subject matter experts, and instead of them having to be at that specific location, they can be in 10 places at once.
Brent.
Yeah, the other thing is a design question. So the ships and the way we design, the way that we build, they're not necessarily together. So the design for like a Navy ship or design for a commercial ship in the United States needs to be informed heavily by the industrial capacity and capability of the yards, and then have some margin for recapitalization and modernization. That's not how things are done in like South Korea or Japan. The design for the ship is informed by what can the yard build, and so there's an assurity that the design can be built on time and on cost, rather than a design of what we want and then try to find someone who can build that. And then they have to retool. So there's all these other risks and costs by the way that we do business. So we have to change the way we do business in this regard, which makes it a great environment for greenfield kind of opportunities. Smart ports, robotic systems, but also the design of the ship that incorporates additive manufactured components, but also sections of the ship, which is also helpful for battle damage. So if a ship takes a missile hit, you can also repair it much quickly. And there's some very interesting stuff in that. But we really need to think from the keel up, from the design, and also in a future kind of shipyard, looking for a more long-term kind of investment that incorporates future technology and processes into the design of the future ship together as we build and break ground on a new shipyard. And so, I mean, we need a new public shipyard. It's something I've really argued for. That's in the nuclear world, but we need to probably look at a GOCO, a government-owned, commercially operated kind of environment as we navigate this transition to what I just described.
I want to talk a bit about money, but before then, I'm going to fact check myself. There's not billions going into the Build Submarines campaign. I was referring to the billions that is going into building up the submarine industrial base. I do believe that the contracts with Blue Forge Alliance that is running the Build Submarines campaign, I think that comes just under $1 billion. If you can correct, does that sound about right?
That's the overall scope of the contract.
Yes.
We have not funded to that level yet, but
Yeah.
yes, that's roughly the scope of the contract.
Yes, okay. So I just wanted to clear that up for everybody in the audience. But I do want to talk more about money. Chris, how is the CR impacting your mission?
Right now, we're okay. We're all watching what's going to happen here in a few weeks, so
Yeah.
that's what we're nervous about because you obviously understand in the CR, unless you get anomalies or other ability, we're kind of back at our prior year of funding level. And so if we end up in another CR, a full year CR, or we end up in some kind of situation like that, it will have an impact on our production. Mainly on where we think about where we have ships that need to do some work to finish those ships. That's what we're worried about right now. But we're all watching that. Right now we're okay, but we need to obviously pay close attention to what's going on in the Hill right now with the budget.
Yeah. And it's a new administration, and there's always a lot of change, and there's definitely proposed cuts across the board or trims or reallocation of funds. But one of the things that I feel like is not talked about a lot when it comes to manufacturing is the potential effect that like tariffs could have on a shipbuilding industrial base that is already kind of struggling, and when solving a lot of these problems, as Brent mentioned earlier, usually the answer is more funds. So down the line, if you guys have thoughts.
I would just say, first off, I want to give Congress credit.
Okay.
As a percentage of our Navy top line, we have more money going into shipbuilding than we have since the Reagan buildup, right? Mm-hmm. From my perspective, Congress has done their job, right? They have set in motion today that we have more shipbuilding resources available than we've had in a long time. And to the point where now we have over 100 ships on contract, mm-hmm. and we have 55 in construction. I mean, think about that. I mean, that is something we haven't seen in a while. So from my perspective, this is not much about resources. It's about our ability to execute those resources and our ability to get the industrial base and everything else that comes together to make this thing really work. Mm-hmm. But clearly, if you start changing variables in the equation, there are impacts, right? My biggest concern really is about the workforce, because the single largest thing that drives the cost of our platforms is the labor associated with that construction, right? So I got to get that right, and I got to get to the point where I have not a green workforce anymore, but a workforce that's learning, a workforce that's stable, we're not having to relearn, and I think that's where my head is right now. But what clearly, when we come through the tariffs or other things, we'll have to kind of work through that, because That's all things that get worked out between us and the shipbuilder when we go through contract negotiations, but it's something that we pay close attention to.
Brent?
Yeah, I was going to say the 8%, just to be clear, to me, in my experiences, this is a reprogramming drill. And I think that was clarified today at the cabinet meeting. Part of it was televised. And so it clearly, when I look at the 17 focus areas, I see Columbia in there, inside the NC2, so it's inside the nuclear. So that's good, because that's been a priority for a long time. I also see Virginia-class submarine. This is good. I'm not quite sure what is going to be reprogrammed and prioritized in the executable shipbuilding. I'm going to assume that's Ford class, and it's going to be the Arleigh Burke, so these are stable designs. So I see this 8% not as a cut, but as a reprogramming drill that many of us have been in government are familiar with. That's what it feels like. And where it could be going, it's certainly going to prioritize a trend that we've also seen Congress back up, and that is putting more money into shipbuilding, and also directing money into the industrial base, the shipbuilding industrial base specifically. I may have specific disagreements on what program specific how we go about it, but the intent is to turn that curve into expansion. And you have to do some investment in the industrial base to get there.
To Brent's point, when I look at those 17 priorities from SecDef, we're in 10 out of 17. I think that's good, but there are going to be some reprogramming things that move around that we have to, figure out. But overall, I think from our perspective, this is good for us. It sends a clear signal to the industry, to the people that we work with. And it's not just about shipbuilding. Munitions is a big issue. We got to talk more about munitions because clearly ships are important. Ships give us presence. Ships are what we have to put sailors to sea. But we also got to make sure we get the munitions industry healthy. There are similar stories when you really pull back and you think about supply chain, you think about technology and people. But I think it's good that that's also in there because that's just as important in many ways as our industrial base that builds ships.
Just the final thing, it's pretty clear in the campaign leading up to the presidential elections and what we've heard in the lead up and since the inauguration is that shipbuilding, naval shipbuilding, is one of the principal ways, if not the principal way, that the new team views the re-industrialization, which is a priority of President Trump, moving forward. So there's going to be a lot of attention. There's going to be a lot of political pressure to get results. And that also probably means there's going to be more resources made available. It means there's also going to be less room for excuses of not getting and delivering results either. So there's going to be a lot of pressure. I would probably characterize as tough love that's coming to an industry that's really not been paid too much attention. It's coming, and I think that's a good thing for shipbuilding. But things like what Gecko's doing, what Govini's doing, and many others in the technical realm of things, we need to also kind of bring it together very rapidly and have a strategic plan for new shipyards and new ship designs, as well as how we're going to take advantage of all this resources, authorities, and attention to accelerate the plans and the ships that are being built now that are too far behind.
Yeah.
And I'll just be clear, when we talk about this, it isn't just the states that have the big shipyards, right? When you think about the suppliers in the industrial base right now, at least on the Navy side, NAVSEA side, last time I checked, it was 36 states have some play in our industrial base and support our construction. So it is a national issue, right? Everyone likes to think about the big yards, and they all hear about those places, whether in the Gulf Coast or Northeast. But it really does impact across the nation. And I think we need to do a better job of communicating that. A lot of people don't realize where some of these people are. They're companies many of you have never even heard of, but they are providing critical components for the construction of our ships.
I want to pull more on the munitions threads because it sounded like you wanted to talk more about that. Can you talk about the specific production challenges there and how the U.S. manufacturing base can kind of get after that?
So clearly in that area, what's going on in the real world is having a say, right? Because we are now using weapons in whether it's the Red Sea or weapons that are provided from our stockpile to Ukraine. So the real world's having a say on the munitions side. But the same challenges I'm having in ship construction in terms of meeting things on time in terms of delivery, we're struggling. And it's a lot of the same issues, key components, not having enough people at some of the providers. Just about across the board, I can show you a very similar story on the munitions side. And so I'm trying to get the team working on the maritime industrial base to kind of share some of those lessons learned in terms of illuminating the supply chain, where do we have critical components, what can we do to open up more providers, because clearly that's an area we got to get healthy. And I would just also remind people, especially on the high-end weapons, those are not simple things to build. When you're talking about an SM-6 or you're talking about a Tomahawk, those are very technical, very similar. You got to have a fairly high-end workforce that knows what they're doing, that can really do that work, right? And so to me, that's the thing we really haven't paid enough attention to. You hear it a little bit because of what's been going on with Ukraine, but I don't think we've told the story well enough that it's really something for the high-end fight that we have to get healthy. And we have had some help from Congress as well as from the previous administration to start some of those development efforts, but it's a very similar story to what you're hearing in the shipbuilding side.
And Troy, Brent, on the munitions side, are there any, I guess, what are your thoughts in terms of improving that industrial base?
Yeah, yesterday this was kind of a topic up on the Hill. I was asked this also on the Red Sea. So the Navy kind of characterized and gave a list of all the munitions that were used, expended against the Houthis, not for the full time, but for the majority of the time that we've been involved in combat operations, the most intense since World War II for Navy, like Navy taking shots, serious, attacks against it. It's going to take us months, if not years, to replace everything that was expended, let alone set aside the cost. Part of that is because we do have much the same with shipbuilding. We have an industry that's not been in a real rapid growth kind of posture, and they need to. And I think that second invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and now the Red Sea is like hammering the point. And it's unmistakable, it's unavoidable that we have to do better in that. But the complexity of the munitions, the supply chain, there's another interesting piece to this. You could look at the rocket motors for these things. There was a time when most of those components were coming from the same people we'd been shooting at. That's a problem. And so better understanding of our supply chain, beyond the second, third, fourth tier of that, and understanding where we could rapidly source if we needed to, allies preferably that are doing co-production, is one way to get at this problem. But we need to do better on the munitions side on the global supply chain network that we have become reliant on for the munitions. I'd say that's more of a problem in munitions and more stark than it is in the shipbuilding.
Interesting. I want to go back a little bit to uncrewed systems because that's part of the CNO's NAV plan, in terms of integrating uncrewed systems into the fleet to create a hybrid fleet. I'm curious, though, we talk about having these easy to make, highly attributable systems, but when you're talking about, uncrewed surface vehicles or even subsurface vehicles, like these are still pretty big, and they're going to need some space to be made. And so I'm curious, like, what your perspectives are. Can that actually be done at scale when you're talking about maybe in the future having a Virginia-class submarine commanding hundreds of uncrewed systems?
So I'm a Westpac sailor. I have background in robotics once upon a time, and so I love this topic. And this is the only way we're going to level or catch up with the pacing threat to China that we've let pass us by. It's the only way we're going to reset that and restore deterrence. But the replicator program, with a lot of the small expendable, it has a use, but in the Pacific it has a limited kind of utility. And you're going to have to pair unmanned with manned ships, platforms, air or surface or submerged. What I see the most important thing that we should be doing is removing the hold on the Mariner-type larger unmanned vessels. They can carry Connex box missile systems. A couple of years ago, one of these ships actually shot an SM-6 from a container off of the Southern California coast. So we already know we can do it. We have the platform. It's been operating. It just deployed last year, several of these ships from California all the way to Japan, down to Australia and back. So we've learned a lot, but we're only going to continue this increasing, accelerated learning curve by doing. This is also the lesson of Task Force 59 with the smaller unmanned for sensor networks in contact with the enemy, with the Iranians. They actually picked up a few of these. But we learn very fast by doing. We need to start producing, get a small group of like 6 of these with a destroyer rotating out there, but just doing donuts in the middle of the Philippine Sea away from interfering shipping and away from hostile China, or if the Chinese want to come out and play, or the Russians, we can relocate with enough time. But we need to start we need to put real munitions on there, say Tomahawks inside the conics, as well as SM-6 and others. And eventually, you can change those out with the weapons that matter in a real fight with China from that distance. Hypersonics is what's in my mind. But you need to start getting the routines, the people that have to maintain and operate this, the command element needs to have a deeper appreciation of how the concept of operations with this mixed manned and unmanned actually works. And the Navy's moving on this, but they need to go faster. You heard that also in the testimony from the DepSecDef. Everyone knows we have to go faster, so let's go faster.
So I would just offer, it's about the force design, and I think what you're seeing is that we want to have this sort of hybrid fleet, which means you need some things on the high end, some things in the middle. So think about DDGs on the high end, frigates, and then some kind of unmanned. What we have to be careful about, though, is we don't over-specify what we want in the unmanned. I can make an unmanned platform just as complicated as a manned platform. It's about the ConOps, it's about the learning, it's about finding the sweet spot, right? MQ-25 is as complicated as an F-18. We don't want to do that on the surface Navy. So we have to think through this, and I think we got to experiment, we have to learn, and it's about sort of this hybrid fleet and about having options and then figuring out the right mix between those. But we got to be really careful, because if I make it too hard, I'm going to start putting things on there. They're going to make it just as big as a manned platform. I'm going to have probably some sailors on there sometime, and so we just have to figure that out. But I do believe there is a sweet spot, and that's what we've been doing with the medium, and we've been doing to small, that we just got to keep iterating. And then we'll finally, I think, figure out what is the right force structure, but we got to kind of experiment here, because we don't want to make this something that only 1 or 2 places in the Navy can build. This is an opportunity also to help the industrial base by spreading some things out, but we got to get it right. And that same analogy works undersea too. XLUUV is pretty complicated, and that is a fairly challenging ConOp and a fairly challenging mission. It's going to be, a little bit more complicated to produce, but I could probably do smaller things and iterate and do some things faster if I think through those ConOps and get the requirements right. But I just remind people, unmanned's a technology area. We really got to think about what the ConOps is and think about what problem we're trying to solve, so we don't end up over-speccing something and then I get beat up for, why is this so hard? Why does it cost so much? Well, it's because we really didn't get to the right place in terms of what we were really trying to solve.
Yeah. The real danger is the longer that we admire this, and this is why I was so upset when we actually put the hold on the actual series order for like the first set of 6 of these medium or larger, like the Mariner that was out there that deployed. Just go ahead and get the order at what you have right now, and then the next iteration adjust and to take a very iterative kind of engineering approach is what was needed. But the longer that we admire this problem, the longer there's more requirements, more cooks come into the kitchen on this, and the designing gets more complex, cost uncertainty, and meanwhile you've delivered nothing and you've learned little.
Troy, I want you to help close out this last round. I want to talk about maintenance and sustainment and what the challenges are there, and if you think that the capacity or technology actually exists to make sure that all of these either attritable or like the bigger platforms, if they can be well maintained and sustained.
Yeah, I mean, to state an obvious point, once you build something, you're now sustaining it, and so that's a challenge. I mean, things are constantly depreciating when you do that. I think, to draw on a couple themes here, there are a lot of, I think the funding sources are there. There's just, how do you drive the efficiencies? How do you create more information sooner in the process? The sort of thing that, across commercial and government have been sort of the thing everyone's driving towards is a predictive maintenance. And the only way to get to predictive maintenance is to have really high fidelity data to bend that cost curve. And to have that data served at the right point. It's too late, if we're in a CNO availability to be discovering things. We have to have that information 12 months ahead of time so we can have the materials ready, we can have the labor ready, we can have a targeted and actionable plan. we want people that are the capable mechanics and engineers on the ship to be turning wrenches and making decisions versus trying to assess what's going on. And we believe very strongly that this data foundation exists and it's growing, but it needs to be unlocked inside of the organization. Like there's leverage that can be had inside of the enterprise, because today that knowledge may only exist at the lower levels, at the places where it's really important to turn the wrenches. But how do you get that in a broad, holistic way across the class of ships or across the fleet? That's really where Gecko's turned its attention to.
In our final minute, I'm going to ask each of you what your recommendation would be for the incoming Navy Secretary. Brent, I'm looking at you. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so no surprises for me. And I'll just reiterate some of my top lines. One, we know what ships we need in the next 5 years. The designs are stable. Naval Act, hardwire the money so it's predictable, it's there. Get the contracts stable. I mean, I'm a big fan of fixed pricing. There's benefits and there's disadvantages to it, I know, but we need to also have things like saws so that we can then take some of that money that's put into the system, the industry can decide, because they know best how to build best, so that they can then make the labor investments and the capital investments with that contract. So that's one, a Naval Act. Number two, go ahead and put an order in and start building and get those larger unmanned vessels. I would say the design that's already there, probably more like the medium, which is the Mariner. But just take what you've got. That's our comparative advantage. We have an industrial base that has been doing that for offshore wind and offshore oil. Just get 6. That's the first flight of what will be an iterative process, and get going. And then finally, we need a national maritime industrial rejuvenation. Part of that, the most visible, is the Ships for America Act, but that's not all. And some of the executive orders that are coming out of the new administration on investment strategies are helpful also.
Chris, any words?
Yeah, here's what I would say if I get asked. I'm not sure if I will or not, but we'll see. The first thing I remind people is we've done this before. Go back and read Freedom's Forge during World War II. We know how to do this, right? But what I got to find is who's the Henry Kaiser, who's the Bill Knudsen that's going to bring industry into the government to help us really start acting and thinking differently, and how do we really get after modernizing, accelerating, and doing it. So that'd be my first thing is we know how to do this, we know the playbook, but I need the Secretary to rise up and make this into a national issue, work with the Coast Guard, work with MARAD, and really rally folks together and help us bring the right experts in. We got the contracts, we've got people, we just now need to figure out how to go unleash those people and have them really start turning out the ships and the weapons and the things we need to go fight and win.
Thank you so much to all of you for being here, and please join me in thanking them for being here. Let's go.